Everyone, and thank you for joining us for our second installment of Penn Medicine Presents, The Genetics of Addiction, How Discovery is Informing the Path Forward for Opioid Addiction Treatment, Intervention, and Prevention. My name is Cheryl Garten, and I work in the Penn Medicine Development Office and support the work of the experts you're going to hear today. And I just wanted to let you know, I want to remind everybody that the platform we're using today will have your video and your microphone muted. So we encourage you to put any questions you might have into the Q&A box to the right of your screen. During the Q&A portion of today's program, we will be answering as many questions as we can. We've got a few selected from our pre-submitted questions, and we're going to, if time allows, get to a few in the Q&A box. And due to our time limit, we are going to try to answer those that apply most broadly to today's content. But in the next few days, we will be sending out a follow-up email, and in that email, we'll provide a link to this recording as well as relevant resources, including access to care and treatment. Feel free to respond to that email if you still have unanswered questions, and we'll do our best to forward those to the appropriate clinicians or staff members. We appreciate your patience as we've had an overwhelming response to these sessions, and we're doing our best to continue the discussion and provide the best information we are able. So now I would love to introduce our wonderful moderator, Hallie Edelman. Hallie is the co-director and producer of Our American Family, an audience award-winning documentary about a close-knit Philadelphia family struggling with generational addiction. As the co-founder of World of Ha Productions, she supports filmmakers and films like The Social Dilemma and U.S. Kids. And with a PhD in education, she has taught elementary through university students, authored children's books like Way Past Mad and Way Past Worried, and she served as an advocate for quality education and mental health initiatives. Hallie, we cannot thank you enough for lending your compassionate expertise to this series and for all the work you do for such an important public health issue and giving voice to those that are facing its devastating effects. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you so much for having me back. I'm really excited to be here and have the opportunity to interview some of the best doctors and researchers in the world here at Penn Medicine, really for our community to understand what work they're doing to have a better sense of how we can make an impact in the field of addiction, substance use disorders, opioid use disorders. So I'm just honored to be here and to help lift the work of these incredible researchers and clinicians. So I guess let's get started. For me, it's was really exciting to see who was attending our session, who you are with us here today. And it seemed like we had so many people who were researchers, other clinicians, families in crisis, people working in crisis centers, people struggling with chronic pain. So it is our goal to really give you a broad look at what's going on with these researchers and doctors that are joining us today, but also to really then try to hone in on as many of the questions that have been sent in to us in advance so that you can walk away with an understanding of a little bit more of what's impacting our community. We already know that over 21 million Americans are struggling with addiction, and so many family members are struggling alongside them. We know that, throughout COVID and, in the past, we've had 93,000 overdose deaths, and in the city of Philadelphia alone, 1,200 overdoses. So it's overdose deaths. So it's very exciting for us to continue to pick open this topic. And for part one, we're going to be having 4 parts to this session. For part one, we're going to be interviewing Dr. Kember and Dr. Kranzler, and that's really going to be focused on understanding the genetic underpinnings of substance use disorders. For part 2 of our event, we're going to be understanding which neurons are responsive to pain and opioids. We're going to be speaking with Dr. Corder for part 2. And for part 3, Dr. Campman returns to talk to us about understanding opioid use and substance use medications and also collaborative care models of treatment. And then finally, for part 4, we're going to tend to more of our group's questions. So I'd love to invite on, while I share the bios for Dr. Kember and Dr. Kranzler, to begin part 1 of understanding the genetic underpinnings of substance use disorders. And Dr. Rachel Kember is a research assistant professor of psychiatry at the University of Pennsylvania. She received her PhD in social, genetic, and developmental psychiatry from the Institute of Psychiatry, King's College London in 2012. Her work focuses on identifying the genetic architecture that underlies complex disorders. She has expertise in biomedical informatics and the integration of electronic health records with genomics data. Her research work has focused on using large biobank data sets, including the Penn Medicine Biobank, which we'll hear more about tonight, and the Million Veteran Program, to identify the complex phenotypic and genomic interactions that lead to substance use and psychiatric disorders. Welcome, Dr. Kember. It's great to see you here.
Thank you so much.
And Dr. Kember's partner in crime, shall I call him, is Dr. Kranzler. He is the Benjamin Rush Professor of Psychiatry and Director of the Center for Studies of Addiction at the University of Pennsylvania's Perelman School of Medicine. Dr. Kranzler's research focuses on the genetics and pharmacology of drugs of abuse, and the treatment of substance use disorders. His research has been continuously supported since 1987 by grants from the National Institutes of Health. He has authored more than 600 journal articles, book chapters, or books, and is the editor of the Journal of Alcoholism, Clinical and Experimental Research. His work currently focuses on the etiology and precision treatment of alcohol, opioid, and nicotine use disorders through pharmacogenetics. And now I get a sticker for reading these big words and having these wonderful doctors here with me. So just to start, Dr. Kember and Dr. Kranzler, how do you define substance use disorder? Let's start with right there.
Okay, I think I'll take that one. Basically, I'm going to tell you how it's defined technically, and then I'm going to tell you what my definition is. There are two systems: the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Bible of the American Psychiatric Association, and that's widely used clinically. And in addition, the WHO, the World Health Organization's International Classification of Diseases, or the ICD, which is currently in its 10th revision, is used as well. And we'll probably end up talking about some of that because it's often used in electronic health records data. That said, basically an addictive disorder is a disorder in which there's impaired control. With respect to substances, it's impaired control of the use of the substance. So, for example, there's the old Mark Twain quote, "Quitting smoking is easy. I've done it 1,000 times." That's a measure of impaired control, not being able to stop or cut down use, and that's kind of the essence of addiction, and it can extend to other behaviors besides substance use disorders.
So
and
what is
all the problems that then accrue are because there's this cumulative burden of exposure to substances. So there are medical problems or psychiatric problems.
Okay, so what does it mean when someone says that this impaired control or this disorder is genetic?
I can answer that. When we say something is genetic, what we mean is that there are genetic variants, so these are changes in someone's DNA, that can contribute to an individual's risk for the disorder. For some phenotypes or diseases, just a single change in your DNA can mean that you have that disorder, for instance, cystic fibrosis. However, for a more complex disorder, such as substance use disorder, it's really the result of many small changes throughout an individual's genome, coupled with the environment that they're in and the things that they have been exposed to. So there is never a point for these complex disorders where the genetic risk for the disorder is absolute. It certainly comes together with other factors in order for someone to end up with that disorder.
So if someone's talking about a substance use disorder being genetically driven, what you're saying is it can have a genetic component, but typically there are other components, like you had mentioned, environmental factors that also play a role. And is besides environment, are there other things then that could push someone from consumption or having a predisposition genetically to having this full-blown disorder?
Dr. Kranzler, would you like to?
Sure. So I think that availability is a key dimension. If you have a predisposition to use excessively, and you have ready access to substances, then you're likely to have, more likely to make the transition from use to problematic use or excessive use. And so availability is a key environmental factor. And for example, the opioid epidemic occurred because of the widespread availability of opioids, prescription opioids initially, and now there's widespread access to very potent opioids like fentanyl, which are being sold and used illicitly.
So access is really key as far from what you're sharing. And the other piece that, when we talk about getting back to genetics a little bit, one of the questions that one of our guests had asked, whether or not it's coupled with environment or access or anything else to move from consumption disorder, is there an addiction gene? Does an addiction gene exist? That's one of the big questions that's out there.
That's a really interesting question, and the straightforward answer would be no. As I mentioned, really these substance use disorders develop from multiple changes across the genome. In our work, we've certainly discovered some genes that are involved, but there is no single addiction gene. We do also see that there are some genes and variants that increase risk across multiple different disorders. So maybe that would be closer to an addiction quality rather than addiction for a particular substance. But again, it's multiple small changes across the genome, and there's no single gene or variant that are involved to cause these disorders.
So since you've both been working to understand the genetics behind substance use disorder and opioid use disorder, can you tell us a little bit more about your research in this area, what findings that you've been, realizing as a result of your work?
Well, as you mentioned in our introduction, we've been using biobanks and electronic health records, such as the Penn Medicine Biobank and the Million Veteran Program. Now, these are very large data sets where individuals have signed up to participate in research and given their genetic data, and then they're linked to their electronic health records. We have recently used the data from the Million Veteran Program to run a genome-wide association study of opioid use disorder. So to do this, we define people with opioid use disorder and people without, and we look across the genome at multiple different sites and ask if that genetic variant is at a different rate in people with the disorder compared to those without the disorder. And again, this could be a very, very small difference. It could be that, 50% of people with the disorder have it and 49% don't. But that change is enough for us to say this variant may be playing a role in the disorder. The recent work that we've done for opioid use disorder has now identified 14 variants across the genome, but we're expecting that many, many more will be identified as we continue this work.
And you had mentioned when we spoke prior to this conversation that part of that work had a goal of then creating these polygenic risk scores. Can you tell us more about that? What does that even mean, and why would that be important?
Well, polygenic risk scores are really an estimate or a measure of someone's genetic risk for disorder. And they start from these genome-wide association studies, because then for each variant we have an effect size. And we then go to a new individual and we can say, do they have this variant? And we weight by that effect size, and we continue this throughout the genome. So a polygenic risk score is really a summation of an individual's entire genome that can represent their genetic risk for disorder. These are of great use in research. However, they are currently not advanced enough to be predictive. So I could not tell you from looking at an individual's polygenic risk score if that person actually had the disease or not. All I would be able to tell you is in terms of across the entire population, whether or not they're at slightly increased or decreased risk for the disease. But again, it would then be along with the environment, access, and so on and so forth in terms of whether they then developed a substance use disorder.
So, and you had spoken also about sometimes these risk scores can then down the road help people take preventative measures. Like when people are given risk scores for different cardiac events. Is that something that is the hope with creating these polygenic risk scores?
I think that's the eventual hope. Many of us have probably heard about precision medicine, the idea that your genetics could be used either to let you know what disorders you may be at risk for, or to let you know what treatments may be best for you. I think that in the future, we may be at a point where we can use these risk scores in that way. I think we're probably looking a decade or so ahead before we get to that point.
And what about pharmacogenetics? You shared that you're also looking at different genetic markers to better predict people's responses to certain medications like buprenorphine and other drugs. Can you tell us a little bit more about that work and what that might mean for people who are struggling with substance use disorders?
Sure. So one point that I think needs to be made is that these studies depend on very large samples because the effects of any specific variant are small. And so they need to be, there need to be very large samples to detect them. And this becomes a particular limitation for pharmacogenetics because not only do you need to identify people who have a specific disorder, but then you need to identify people with a disorder who have been treated for that disorder, who are numerous enough to provide the statistical power to draw inferences about what predicts response to the drug. So we completed a study and have published it from the Million Veteran Program, looking at the genetic predictors of the response to buprenorphine, which is a widely used opiate medication. And we did not have a large enough sample, even though we had a couple of thousand individuals who had received buprenorphine. It was not adequate to reach the levels of statistical significance that are required when you're looking at something genome-wide. So we got some promising candidates, but we did not reach statistical significance. So we're looking to augment the sample sizes, which you can do through meta-analysis, a statistical approach to combining results from multiple studies. So that's the big limitation here in terms of polygenic risk scores, in terms of pharmacogenetics. It's having an adequate sample, and we're talking about thousands to millions, to generate statistics that are useful, given the small effects in predicting either someone's likelihood of developing a disorder or their likelihood after having developed it of responding to a specific medication.
And is it important, in addition, for that sample to be large, for the sample to also be diverse?
Well, much of the work is done initially within population groups because there are differences in allele frequencies, for example, and in the relations between different alleles frequencies by population. So initially one does studies within population. And in fact, that's led to probably, to a significant disparity because most genome-wide association studies have been done in European populations. You can do meta-analysis across populations. And Rachel mentioned that we had done that for opioid use disorder. But what is currently also a major limitation in the field is that so much of the work has been done in European ancestry populations that it's difficult to generalize it to other population groups. And there probably are discoveries that we're going to be able to make with a more diverse population than with diverse sample than we currently are making with the limited diversity that we have. So there's a real push and an interest in the field to diversify the samples by a population group.
Yeah, it sounds so important. It also sounds important what you're doing, trying to develop these risk scores so that families who are struggling or individuals can get information in advance of what a predisposition might be. And also when you're talking about the pharmacogenetics, I kind of think, I know this is probably down the road, but I think about the mouth swab and different ways to kind of swab people and give them information of, hey, maybe this medication is right for you, or maybe this medication won't be right for you based on your genetics. But what you're saying is that in order for us to further this research in the best possible way, we need bigger sample sizes. Am I hearing that right? And are those the right pieces, the way that research can be realized down the road?
Absolutely. It's astonishing at how the field has grown, and a lot of what's been possible has resulted from the accumulation of large samples, or the accrual of large samples. And we're talking about samples sometimes that exceed 1 million individuals. That's very powerful, but we lack that for some disorders. We lack that for some population groups, and we particularly lack it for treatment. Patients participating in treatment studies, because it's much harder to find people who have completed a treatment, either a study or a course of treatment clinically, who can be included in a pharmacogenetic study.
And that's great, because I think people are always asking when there is something going on, a disorder or something that feels sometimes so frustrating, and people feel helpless or hopeless at different points. When we ask, well, what can I do, or what can people do, is one of the things that people could do, kind of become part of these research samples. And if so, how can they become involved in these biobanks or, samples that you're talking about?
Well, at Penn, for example, the Penn Medicine Biobank, people are often invited in the context of giving a blood sample for routine clinical tests or for during clinical visits. We're going to circulate after the fact by email a list of treatment providers that people can access and a list of research opportunities. The Center for Studies of Addiction, where we all work, at least Kyle, Rachel, and I do, has a volunteer phone line, and we'll circulate that number for people who are interested in participating in research.
That's great. Thank you. So what do both of you still want to understand related to the genetics of opioid use disorder and substance use disorder? And what do you want the general public to understand?
Shall I start with one and then you can go into it? Well, as I mentioned from our genome-wide association study that we've conducted, we've identified 14 genetic variants that are associated with opioid use disorder. But for some other psychiatric disorders, there have been larger studies conducted which have identified hundreds. And so I think that's one of the next steps, is for us to continue this research, as Hank said, in larger and larger samples, so that we can identify more genetic variants. And what that then gets us back to is the actual biology of the disorder. You know, which pathways are important, which tissues in the body are important, what are these genetic changes actually doing that put somebody at risk. In the work in the opioid use disorder genome-wide association study, one of the things that's come out of that, and this was already hypothesized in the field, of course, but is that this is really a brain disorder. It is the brain regions that are important. Gene expression changes in the brain, so that's whether or not genes are expressed in the brain on at particular levels. And I think that's important for the public to understand, that this is not something that should be stigmatized, but this is something where in the future, hopefully, there will be treatments and solutions to this.
Thank you. Dr. Kranz, do you have anything you want to add?
I think that was a very, very well put. And as long as 25 years ago, the head of the National Institute on Drug Abuse published an article that was titled, "Addiction is a Brain Disease, and it Matters." And I think we now have a very clear proof for opioid use disorder that is in fact the case. Now, it's not completely free of volition, but it's like many diseases for which there's a clear genetic basis. And there are treatments currently, and there will hopefully be better treatments that are tailored to individuals as we learn more about the genetics and the biology.
So anything else that either of you want to add before we head into part two? And just so grateful for both of you for your, not only your research, but for your time and in sharing these promising pieces of your work of not just identifying the variants that are connected, but also, you know, hoping to kind of come full force in a few years and share here some risk scores and here's some really important information related to pharmacogenetics. So thanks for your work, and anything else you want to share?
I think that's pretty much it.
All right.
Happy to answer a question.
Yeah, thank you for taking the time to listen.
Thank you. I know that you have a community that's excited to hear from you, so thanks for your work. So for part two, we are excited to be speaking also with Dr. Corder, and this part is going to focus on understanding which neurons are responsive to pain and opioids. So as Dr. Corder's coming on, let me tell you a little bit about him. Dr. Gregory Corder, PhD, is an assistant professor in the departments of psychiatry and neuroscience in the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. His lab aims to decipher the neural underpinnings of how the brain generates the perception of pain and investigates the changes within these neural networks that promote the transition to chronic pain and drug abuse. Dr. Corder's work has been featured in Science, Nature, Nature Medicine, and Neuron, among other top scientific journals, and is supported by the NIH Director's DP2 New Innovator Award, the National Institute of General Medical Sciences, and the National Institute on Drug Abuse. His lab continues to develop optical and genetic techniques to visualize and control brain circuits with the goal of advancing translational therapeutics that reduce the mental health disorders associated with chronic pain and lessen the reliance on prescription opioids. Dr. Corder, it's great to have you.
Hi, it's nice to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So before we discuss your research, can you tell us, what do opioids do in the brain?
Absolutely, yeah. So I think we're all familiar with maybe different types of drugs called opioids. This is a large class of compounds that we generally hear about as painkillers, or we might be thinking of morphine or OxyContin and these types of things. But what these molecules are doing is they're actually kind of hijacking the different proteins or parts of the brain that our endogenous opioids actually were evolutionarily designed to interact with. And so what do I mean by an endogenous opioid? These are chemical compounds produced by the cells in your brains, or these neurons, that have a similar physical shape to the actual compounds such as morphine. And these compounds then bind to structures called a mu-opioid receptor that are expressed on the surface of neurons within the brain. And so what opioids do, whether they're these proteins, these endogenous opioids coming from inside the brain, or a drug you might consume, such as morphine, you bind to this receptor, and that triggers this cascade of signaling events inside of neurons, which actually results in the neurons actually quieting their activity overall. And so neurons in your brain, they want to talk to each other to transmit information. And when you take an opioid, you actually have quieting of certain cell types or certain neurons in the brain. And ultimately, what can happen with regard to substance use disorders, if we put it into context there, is you might have activation of cells responsible for reward, so feeling good. This is what we would call hedonic pleasure overall. But you can also have opioids act on different parts of the brain that would result in the perception of pain. Let's say if you had just had surgery and you were to take an opioid, the feeling of pain would actually go down too. And this gives us a bit of a clue that opioids are having different effects depending on which cells in the brain or different parts of the nervous system the opioids are binding to these opioid receptors. And so it's important to kind of try to figure out where and in which cell types opioids are having an effect, so we can be a bit more precise with how we think these opioids are acting in the brain.
So would it be correct then to say, just based on your response, that opioids in the brain either exacerbate pleasure in a sense, or reduce or quell pain? Is that accurate?
They can do both. Again, it's an amazing sort of phenomena where you have a single molecule and it can have a wide range of effects overall. If you're a normal person, you don't have ongoing pain. There's no pain signal, if you will, to reduce, but you might have activation of this reward, or what we might technically call a positive valence circuit, and you would perceive or feel pleasure. So it is going to exacerbate or turn on that particular part of the brain. But if you were a chronic pain patient and these neurons or cells in the brain that signal there is something unpleasant, there's something related to pain, you would then perceive less pain with these opioids. So it just depends on what we'd call the internal state of a person. Whatever that is will be amplified or decreased by opioids.
Okay, so before we get into your work that really revolves around neurons and neurotransmitters, can you tell us, for the people who aren't researchers, scientists, or who didn't get an A+ in science in school, what are neurons and neurotransmitters? Can you kind of distill that down for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, I'm going to steal a quote from one of our fantastic neuroscience graduate students here at Penn. She recently gave a talk, and she described a neuron as a banana floating in a salty milk pool. And so that sounds odd, but it's actually quite accurate, I think. And so this banana would be our neuron. And so bananas are full of potassium, and so are neurons. And so inside a neuron, you have this high amount of potassium. And outside in our salty milk pool, we have a bunch of sodium and chloride, which makes up salt. as well as calcium. And it's this really interesting cell that exists inside of our brains that by having these potassium or chloride ions, you form what's called an electrochemical imbalance. And so basically you form an electrical charge, and these cells are so unique and so exciting because they can form excitable signals, electrical signals that transmit and move along the surface of these cells. And once you reach a certain point within the cell, you have something called a neurotransmitter release event. And so the way these cells are designed is they have little vesicles or little pockets full of neurotransmitters, which are just other types of proteins or molecules inside of the cells, and they are physically released from the end of one neuron, and they move across the space between to another neuron and interact with that cell, and the signal can move across the brain from neuron to neuron through this what we'd call an electrochemical synapse overall. And so your brain is full of billions of these special cells sending these electrical signals from one region to the other, and different parts of your brain are tuned to do different types of functions, whether it's to feel reward or feel good from taking an opioid, or to feel pain or aversion in another part of the brain. And so it's the interaction of how these cells talk to each other that ultimately leads to all of our thoughts, feelings, emotions, looking at a beautiful sunset or feeling the most excruciating pain. It all results from this like very simple electrochemical signaling between these cells that fit between our ears overall.
So we're going to talk about a little bit about your work with opioid receptors, but before we do, when I say receptor, does that mean all of those neurons also have receptors on them?
Exactly. So not every single neuron in the brain will express or have one of these receptors on it. So a receptor, you can think of like a lock and a key mechanism here. An opioid like morphine or an endogenous opioid would be like the key fitting into the lock. And so the lock is found on the surface of the cell. That key fits in there. And when it turns the lock a certain way, it causes a signaling event inside the cell, which then leads to that banana firing off a salty discharge into another banana, if you will. And that's just how these drugs work on a very, very basic level.
Okay.
But, yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Hopefully that gives us a little bit of background. Thanks to your graduate students who came up with a good visual for all of us. And you've told me in the past, which I thought was really cool, that one of the things that your team is doing is mapping every opioid receptor in the brain, almost like you're creating a Google map for opioid receptors. So based on the context of what you told us, that neurons that they're firing these neurotransmitters, that they receive different, I guess, messages or neurotransmitters, right? Correct me whenever I get something wrong, because obviously I want everybody to understand.
Oh, that's absolutely correct. Yeah.
Perfect. So what is the benefit of developing a map like that? How is that useful?
Absolutely. So the Google Maps sort of thing that Haley mentioned is absolutely, I think, an apt metaphor here. So again, if we think of different parts of our brain need to talk to each other, you could imagine, just like on a Google Maps, you'd have different cities. And how do you want to send information? Let's say you're delivering mail. Like, how do you want to shuttle that mail to different cities? You have to move along roads. And that's how neurons work too. So you have a cell body, and it has this thing called an axon, which is this very long part of the cell. And this is where that electrochemical signal is moving along. And so these axons are these roads between the cities. So if I wanted to have this part of the brain talk to this part of my brain, it's got to move along an axon or this road. And if we could understand where the opioid receptors are along the road, then we might have an idea of how do drugs like morphine or OxyContin or heroin, or how even then pain or other types of genetics work on that road? Like, are there potholes making the road less efficient to move along? Or actually, is it a supercharged highway such that there's more signals going between a particular part of the brain? And both of those things, either having a disrupted, broken road or a supercharged highway, are going to change how information moves in the brain, and that can lead to disease states like substance use. And so by creating these maps, it gives us a better picture of how to make these more precision targeted therapies down the line.
I was also really fascinated when we had spoken prior to this that, a lot of times we're talking about medications that could kind of support people who are struggling with opioid use disorder, but you were also talking about medications or interventions that could actually make people less pain averse. Can you talk to us a little bit about the difference between medications for traditional medications for opioid use disorder and maybe non-opioid medications and other ways to make people less pain averse as an alternative?
Sure. So there's, traditional medications that are available that are still prescribed. Again, this would be opioids that can lead to things like addiction. But there's actually been a large resurgence in psychiatric and psychological interventions. There's actually a very interesting recent study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, where they actually had patients with chronic pain disorders, instead of receiving opioid drugs to treat their chronic low back pain, they actually had them go through just a psychiatric session where they had the patients think about their pain as this emotional threat memory, if you will. And so it really is called pain reprogramming therapy. And it basically it's 8 sessions where physicians will talk to the patients. And it's about the patient reframing that, the pain is not some physical problem, maybe out in their skin, like it's not a traditional injury, but there's actually an emotional memory pathology or disease going on in their head. And it's through this kind of recognition that pain is not a threat or something that's meant to be anxiety producing overall. They actually reported that they had a 98% success rate of their patients reporting almost 100% reduction in their chronic low back pain, just from understanding that their pain itself is not an ongoing threat. And because they actually had a drop in their perceived intensity of their pain, that means that physical changes were occurring in these parts of the brain that mediate anxiety or aversion overall. And so what our goal is now is that using that knowledge that, different types of psychiatric interventions can lead to physical changes in these emotional parts of our brain. Now we can go in our basic science research studies and figure out exactly what those cells were mediating those effects, and looking to see if there are other types of non-traditional approaches such as transcranial magnetic stimulation or focused ultrasound that allow us to really kind of like interfere with the signaling just in those parts of the brain and leaving intact the normal processing in other parts of the brain too. So we really want to try to target this emotional aspect of pain as well as substance use disorders and try to really alleviate the need to rely on things like prescription opioids.
And how does that connect with the opioid receptor map?
Yeah, so opioid medications, they actually do a pretty good job at reducing pain. There's a reason why people have been using different derivatives of opioids for thousands of years. It's because they do actually seem to produce, what we'd call analgesia or pain relief. But if you really ask a patient, what does it feel like to be on, let's say, morphine and to have this analgesia reduction in pain? It's not that the pain itself is gone. It's rather that the pain becomes less bothersome or less aversive to the patient. And again, this gives us a clue that morphine is acting on these emotional parts of the brain and to reduce this kind of threat of pain or this anxiety about pain. And so again, by mapping and knowing where these opioid receptors are, we can design new types of therapies that have a very specific, what we'd call a circuit-targeted approach. So we can not interfere with the reward circuits that would lead to eventual addiction or substance use disorders, but we can have a specific type of intervention that just eliminates pain without the fear of addiction whatsoever from occurring. So that's the ultimate goal of what our lab is trying to do.
And then without people really wanting or seeking an opioid for that reason.
Exactly. And you don't even have to worry about it because you never had to take an opioid in the first place. So if we can eventually get to the point where we don't need to rely on opioids, then we don't have to worry about that whatsoever. We want to mimic the beneficial good parts, what opioids do.
Amazing. Can you explain the relationship? I know you had mentioned that you found a really interesting and meaningful relationship between the amygdala and the cortex. Can you explain what you were finding there?
Exactly. So I sort of alluded to both pain and these motivations to seek and want and desire these opioid drugs. Part of this this motivation or this unpleasantness about pain results from activity in a brain structure called the amygdala. Many of you may have heard of this. It's one of the more well-known parts of the brain, and people tend to think of this, maybe you've heard of it as the fear center of the brain. But this collection of neurons, they really are important for emotion processing. And even something even more basic, it basically allows information within the brain to be kind of categorized as is something good or is something bad. And if it's good, then you might want to approach that thing. And if it's bad, you might want to stay away from that thing overall. But again, these states of opioid use disorders or chronic pain, they kind of hijack and they rewire these approach or avoidance types of circuits, and they can lead to chronic approach or chronic avoidance, again, for addiction or for chronic pain. And we've kind of, again, mapped out across the brain how the amygdala talks to a part of your brain called the neocortex, so right here just behind my scalp. And this is called the anterior cingulate cortex. It has a very fancy name, but this is actually one of the places in the brain that has one of the highest expression or density of these mu opioid receptors. And so we know opioid drugs bind to these cells just here in the part of the brain. And this is where we think that this morphine analgesia or morphine painkiller effect comes from. It's disrupting the ability of emotion circuits in the amygdala from communicating with this cortical region called the cingulate. And this disruption allows for patients to not care about their pain so much. It's disrupting the threat or the anxiety about pain, or it's disrupting that pathological motivation to seek different types of drugs of abuse too. And so this is an area we're very interested in pursuing to look for these very specific types of precision medicines, if you will.
Yeah. So what other interventions, in addition to the precision medicine that you're talking about moving forward as an intervention, what other interventions that are not medication based are others exploring or finding as ways to either reduce pain or, like you're saying, make people feel less pain averse?
Exactly. I've sort of mentioned one study that was in this journal called JAMA where they had patients kind of reevaluate their pain. And again, think of it not as so much of a threat, which sort of is what we're seeing with our brain manipulation therapies overall. But there are other types of research that's really demonstrating that just increasing the well-being of everyone, increasing the amount of social interaction we all have. Our brains are designed to want to make us be around other people and to feel comfortable and loved. And I think just increasing certain basic fundamental things within our lives can actually make us feel more fulfilled. And this fulfilling and love, it kind of sounds like, oh, it's not really scientific, but like all of those thoughts and feelings and emotions, again, this is part of your brain. Your brain is signaling those things. And what opioids are doing is they're replacing these signals for love or for acceptance or for fulfillment. And if we can replace the need for what those opioids are doing in the brain, again, by just like making life better for certain people, those are very simple, basic things we can do from a societal level to kind of combat some of these kind of substance use disorders or chronic pain even. But there are other more direct interventional strategies. Again, we have deep brain stimulators, so we can put in electrical electrodes into the brain and kind of zap these electrochemical cells and make them fire in certain ways that make patients feel less depression, less anxiety, less pain. But there's a large number of things, including biofeedback, that is a way of like understanding the details of your body and how it responds in terms of heart rate and breathing patterns, and understanding ways of incorporating meditation practices that allow us to engage with these emotional parts of our brain, maybe reduce that activity in a natural way without the use of pharmacotherapies overall.
Yeah, so really a shift based on what you're finding and in the focus to really consider in a deeper way these emotional pieces that can come into play.
Well, I think it's amazing that we've had, people have known about these very basic things for thousands and thousands of years of like, and we're just understanding that they work. Meditation, and it works actually, and it's working by these different types of neural activities in the brain. So it's not just some kind of like thing to dismiss. It's actually resculpting the physical neurons in our brain. And so by doing basic research on these types of emotional processes and understanding how the brain is this plastic dynamic thing, it's actually allowing us to refine and revisit some of these older, very quote, simple types of interventions overall. It's a very exciting time, I think, overall, and a need for why it's important for basic scientists to interact and engage with our medical community overall so we can help work together to figure out the details of what's actually happening in our brains.
So what is happening when someone's doing meditation, or what is happening in the brain as it relates to that pleasure that we had spoken about?
Meditation is super interesting. If people are familiar, there's a large number of different forms of meditation. So the one that's probably most common to this audience would be mindfulness or vipassana types of meditation. And this is really focusing on the body and being present. And what current research is sort of suggesting what's happening is there's other parts of the cortex that I mentioned are involved in a process called salience gating. So it's shifting how our brain focuses on signals overall. So by focusing on things like the breath overall, you're kind of using up your brain's attentional power to focus on something very simple like breathing, and it blocks out other signals from your brain coming from the amygdala that are signaling threat, anxiety, or motivation to seek reward. And so there's absolutely resculpting your brain just by focusing on how your body is responding has real physical changes in your brain. It's all about information flow in the brain, how these bananas are talking to each other.
Yeah, and I guess does that also then can that help make someone less pain averse in the way that you were talking about before?
Those are absolutely being explored too. So so things like mindfulness can be applied in certain patients to chronic pain overall. And again, it's a way of naturally rewiring the changes that have occurred in your brain due to pain.
Yeah, so it's really exciting that your research is focused on not just creating this map, but also really using it and trying to deeply understand what can make someone feel less pain averse without using certain medications that could be addictive for them.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of avenues to explore. I wouldn't want to rule out new types of pharmacotherapies or pharmacogenetics or even gene therapies as an avenue my lab is studying. I think we have to explore every option right now. And yeah, it's an exciting time. And I would want everyone listening to know that there are thousands of researchers who are actively pursuing every possible solution. It's just so important that we try to figure this out as fast as we can.
I think that's really comforting for so many people to know how hard researchers are working and just the amazing work that so many people like you are doing. So thank you. Before we sign off with each other, one of the things that you shared with me in a prior discussion is that that you hope there will be more interactions between psychologists, psychiatrists, and neuroscientists. Is this important because of the emotional pieces that you're bringing up here, or why is this really important?
It's important. This will be a slightly technical thing, but I'm not a physician. I don't get the opportunity to interact with patients who are dealing with pain or dealing with substance use disorders. It's really important that we kind of have this bridge between the patient and the basic researchers, and these would be our MD, PhDs, our psychiatrists, our clinician scientists. If we can have more interaction between clinician scientists and basic researchers, I think we can start to model the important aspects of what patients are going through in our preclinical, experimental, laboratory-based studies, and that's only that's only to the benefit of everyone too. If we can model it more correctly, more accurately, we can design better drugs, we can design better interventions that will translate back up to the patients. And so we need constant communication happening at all levels of research.
Dr. Corder, thank you so much for your work and for joining us here tonight. That was amazing.
Thank you.
And I'm really excited for us to all venture into part 3 of our conversation, understanding opiate use disorder and substance use disorder medications and collaborative care models of treatment. Dr. Campman really bringing that emotional piece and the medication piece kind of together, which is what Dr. Corder was talking about a few minutes ago. Dr. Kyle Campman has had extensive experience in the treatment of alcohol, cocaine, and opiate dependence. He's conducted a number of trials testing medications for the treatment of cocaine, alcohol, and opioid dependence, and is a recognized authority on cocaine withdrawal syndrome. Dr. Campman chaired the committee that authorized the ASAM National Practice Guideline for the use of medications in the treatment of addiction involving opioid use. In addition to research, he also works at the Addiction Recovery Unit of the Philadelphia VA Medical Center, where he continues to treat cocaine, alcohol, and opioid dependent patients through medications and psychotherapy. Dr. Campman, I'm excited to be having the opportunity to connect with you again. How are you tonight?
I'm doing great, thank you.
So for people watching, we just got really some great information from all the other doctors of where we're headed, and also what's important related to studying the brain, genetics, and really trying to understand some non-opioid medications as we look forward. But what are some medications when we talk about these disorders, substance use disorder, opioid use disorder, that are already being used? Why are they being used? And what do you see as the pros and cons of each of these medications?
Sure. I always like to start this discussion by just telling people what the perfect medicine for the treatment of opioid use disorder would actually do. And the perfect medicine does 3 things. First of all, it takes away withdrawal symptoms, it reduces craving, and it blocks the high from opioids should a patient slip and use opioids. Right now we have 3 medicines for the treatment of opioid use disorder, none of which is perfect, but all 3 of these medications will address these 3 aspects of effective treatment to a greater or lesser degree. So the 3 medicines we have right now are methadone, buprenorphine, also called Suboxone, and extended-release injectable naltrexone, also called Vivitrol. Now, all 3 of these medicines are effective, but each has specific characteristics that make them more or less attractive to individual patients. For example, let's start with methadone. Methadone is a long-acting opioid agonist. What does that mean? It means it binds to the opiate receptor, the same receptor that heroin binds to, and it activates it. But it's different. It's an oral medicine, very slow in onset, very long-acting, so it doesn't give you the same type of euphoria that one would get from using heroin. So a patient maintained on methadone can go about their lives and they're not bothered by opioid withdrawal or opioid craving. Methadone is also actually very good at blocking the high from abused opioids like heroin. So it has all 3 of the characteristics of an effective medicine: reduces withdrawal, reduces craving, and blocks the high. Now, other things that make methadone attractive is that if you have chronic pain and an opioid use disorder, you can take this medicine and get a nice effect on your pain. Now, the downside of methadone is that it's only available at a methadone clinic. And so initially you have to come and take your medication every day under observation. In addition, patients maintained on methadone are physically dependent on it, so they can't stop abruptly without getting sick. So that's methadone. Buprenorphine is the second of the effective medicines. It's a partial agonist at the opiate receptor. So that means that it binds to the opiate receptor. Not enough to make you high, but enough to take away withdrawal and enough to reduce craving. And it also binds more tightly to that opiate receptor than any other opioid. So if you take it, it's really pretty good at reducing the high from abused opioids like heroin. So like methadone, it has all 3 of those characteristics of an effective medicine. Buprenorphine is safer than methadone, and so it's safe enough that it can be used in a regular doctor's office. Definitely an advantage. The downside of buprenorphine, like methadone, is that you are physically dependent on it, and so if you stop abruptly, you're going to get sick. All right. The last of the effective medications is extended-release injectable naltrexone, Vivitrol. Naltrexone is an opiate receptor antagonist or blocker. It binds to the opiate receptor. It doesn't activate it. But as long as you have that receptor in your brain, you can't get high from opioids, and you can't get re-addicted to it. So it actually has two of the three characteristics of an effective medicine. It takes away craving and blocks the high. Downside of naltrexone is that you have to be detoxified before you can get started on it, and that's often an impediment to starting this medication. It's a once-a-month injection, so you don't have to remember to take a medicine every day, which is definitely a plus. So those are the three we have.
Thank you. You had told us, luckily we had the opportunity in our first conversation for Penn Medicine. You had told us a bit about these medications in the past, and you mentioned that naltrexone is a great drug because people would not be dependent, but then at the same time they'd have to withdraw and have a detox first, which you mentioned to us tonight. But when we recently spoke, you said that you're exploring ways to kind of remove that obstacle for people who are struggling. So what are you exploring? Can you tell us a little bit about what people can then go drive their doctors crazy about and say, hey, what about this?
It's not time for them to drive their doctors crazy about it. But, we want to be able to get people onto Vivitrol faster and easier than they can right now. And ideally, we would like it done as an outpatient rather than having to go away to a depot. What we're looking at are two medications. One is called lofexidine. It's a medicine that's already approved and on the market for the treatment of opiate withdrawal. And what we're going to do to make lofexidine better is to add another medicine called pregabalin. And what pregabalin is really good at is reducing pain and reducing anxiety. So we think that the combination of lofexidine and pregabalin will be able to treat the withdrawal symptoms so that we can actually get people started on Vivitrol within 7 days of them stopping opioids, which is really fast and would be a big service to patients with opioid use disorder.
You had also mentioned that with buprenorphine, which people also know as Suboxone, that with Suboxone, sometimes people are taking it, but then have a difficult time staying with it. Is that why, I know you're exploring, should people be taking a monthly injectable versus should they be taking this sublingually? Is that the purpose behind that research, or is one method of taking this type of medication better than the other?
A big problem with buprenorphine, you already said it, is that people often don't take it the way they're supposed to. And sometimes the medicine gets diverted and abused. And so if we had a once-a-month injectable buprenorphine, we could get all the benefits of buprenorphine without having this problem of diversion and poor adherence. And so that's why extended-release buprenorphine called Sublocade was invented. Now, when Sublocade got approved for the treatment of opioid use disorder, it never really got compared head-to-head with sublingual buprenorphine. And so we really don't know the answer to that question. Is it better? And so that's what this study that we're involved in down at the VA is all about. We're getting together with 19 other VAs, and we're treating hundreds and hundreds of veterans, either on Sublocade or on sublingual buprenorphine, and we're going to find out one way or the other whether or not Sublocade is actually better for the treatment of opioid use disorder than regular sublingual buprenorphine.
And what about people that are feeling the fear? They're coming to this and, maybe thinking, I'm trying to get off a drug. Why would I kind of use drugs to get off a drug? What do you say in those kind of circumstances, or what's your thought on that for families and other clinicians?
So, being addicted and taking a medicine are way two different things. And even though you're physically dependent on buprenorphine or methadone, it takes away all the other bad behaviors that are associated with addiction and the dangerous behaviors. These medicines flat out save lives. If you take methadone, buprenorphine, or naltrexone, you are less likely to overdose and you're less likely to die from overdose. They just flat out save lives. They don't lead to abuse as we see with other opioids. So there's a big difference between being maintained on buprenorphine or methadone and being addicted to an opiate like heroin. Big difference.
You've said in the past, and I know Dr. Quarters touched on this a little bit, but that, it's not really wise to use a medication-only approach when you're treating substance use disorder, opiate use disorder. Why is that?
Yeah, sure. Opioid use disorder is a complicated chronic illness, and it's tough to treat. One of the reasons why it's tough to treat is because, like many other chronic illnesses like diabetes or hypertension, it involves behavior change. Behavior change is tough for patients. The medications are absolutely important, but unless a patient changes their behaviors and moves towards recovery, they're always going to be at risk. They're going to be at risk of dropping out of treatment, stopping their medicines, and relapsing. The counseling aimed at changing behaviors can help patients maintain a stable recovery. Now, another problem patients with opioid use disorder have is the fact that they have other psychiatric illnesses. The majority do have other psychiatric illnesses along with their opioid use disorder. And these psychiatric illnesses make it hard for them to engage in treatment and have recovery. So in addition to the medications for opioid use disorder, they need treatment for these other psychiatric illnesses, and that often involves counseling as well as maybe other psychiatric medications.
So we've started doing this research on collaborative care model. Can you kind of define that for us and what's involved in supporting the participants of that research?
Sure. Okay, so I said most patients come for treatment for their opioid use disorder have another psychiatric illness. And these other psychiatric illnesses can either be a root cause of their opiate addiction or it can just make it tough for them to engage in treatment. Now, standard care right now involves getting your psychiatric treatment at another clinic and your medications for opioid use disorder at another clinic. So we got 2 clinics, multiple providers, and sometimes that's just flat out too much for patients to handle. And they either give up on the psychiatric treatment or they give up on their opioid use disorder treatment. So in the collaborative care model, the thought is, what if we combine the two and take the treatment for the opioid use disorder and the treatment for the psychiatric disorder in the very same clinic? So primary care doctors provide most of the treatment for opioid use disorder right now. So what if we help them out by providing care managers who can do therapy with patients, as well as access to an addiction psychiatrist who can help these primary care doctors deal with these more complicated psychiatric illnesses. One-stop shopping. It makes sense. And that's what this collaborative care trial is all about. Believe it or not, even though this makes a lot of sense when you talk about it, for opioid use disorder, it's never been tested. It's been tested for other addictions and found to be effective, but not for opioid use disorder. So what Dr. David Mandel, Hilary Wagner, and our team are doing is conducting this trial. So we can compare standard care to our collaborative care model. Collaborative care model includes the counseling from the care manager. Primary care doctors have access to an addiction psychiatrist. And in addition, some of the patients will actually have access to a certified recovery specialist, which is really kind of cool. A certified recovery specialist is an individual who's in recovery themselves, who uses their experience and training to provide emotional support for patients with opioid use disorder, help them motivate behavior change, support treatment engagement, retention in treatment, and help the patients generally navigate the treatment system and help them focus on their recovery. So we're going to look to see if this collaborative care is actually better than standard care in improving treatment, both treatment for their opioid use disorder as well as treatment of the psychiatric illness.
Amazing. And you had mentioned it when we had spoken that you were looking for primary care doctors who are interested in participating in this study. Is there a way that they can get involved or?
Sure. All they have to do is email me, call me, text me, email, call, or text Dr. Mandel, Dr. Wagner. All of us would be thrilled to talk to any primary care doctor who wants to include their practice in the collaborative care trial.
Okay, so hopefully in the email that comes out to everybody after this, it'll be like, email Dr. Chapman and blow up his inbox.
The more the merrier.
That's great. Thank you. So what are you seeing as the biggest needs still or the biggest breakthroughs in the field?
All right, so the biggest needs, simple. We got to improve access to care. The truth is that most patients with opioid use disorder don't have access to these effective medications. And so we need to get us to where the patients are and get them treatment. And the second thing is, even though the medicines are good, there's still a lot of dropout, a lot of relapse. So, we really need to improve our treatment, and we need to improve access to treatment, both.
And when you say treatment, you're not just, based on what you've said before with this collaborative care model, you're not just talking about the medications.
No, absolutely not. Medications, again, are important, maybe most important, but still not everything. And we really do need to get people involved in making behavior changes. I call them life changes, and they're hard to make. And without someone helping you do it, it's hard to get into stable recovery with just taking the medicine every day. It really is.
It was interesting, too, that when you had talked about the models in the past, you had talked about, different levels of support being triggered based on what's needed for an individual patient.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about that? Like what you're seeing in a patient trigger another level of support?
Well, I mean, you start with basic medications and basic counseling, and you look to see what happens. If a patient responds to that, that may be all you need. And for many patients, that is all they need. But other patients need more. And that's when you need to get involved in the counseling. You need to get involved in making sure that their other psychiatric illnesses get treated, and making sure that these patients have what they need to succeed and stay in stable recovery.
So before we jump into part 4, because we have so many incredible questions from, our audience, and, they're really being so thoughtful and wondering about, the generational component, and also, pain, how to manage pain. So I'm excited to bring Cheryl back on to really dig into some of our audience's questions. But before we do that, just a prediction, since you've been in this space for so long, how do you think our care for substance use disorders and opiate use disorders will change over the next 10 years? And what other research do you see that's needed?
All right. So, as I said, I hate to be a broken record, but we need to improve access to care, and we need to get medications, better medications. I don't know what that's going to involve, improve our ability to keep patients engaged. We need maybe better medicines, maybe use personalized medicine to make sure that patients get engaged to the best medicine for them. We need to make it easier for them to access treatment. We need to treat their psychiatric illnesses. All these things need to be explored. That's kind of where I think this is going to go. I think we're going to see more long-acting injectable medications. I'm very much in support of that, and I think that's where it's moving. And the primary care doctors will continue to get and be engaged in more and more of the treatment for opioid use disorder. It's going to move out of the specialty clinics and into primary care, which is where it belongs. This is, addictions needs to be treated like a regular medical illness, treated by regular medical doctors in a regular medical facility. I think that's going to help reduce stigma and improve access.
Yeah, so important. Well, Dr. Campman, thank you so much. I know that I'm sure you'll be tapped for some audience questions in a moment, and I just want to thank you for all the great work you're doing and the passion and compassion you bring so that families and individuals struggling don't have to carry a weight of stigma. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Cheryl, we'd love to see if you want to open the floor up to some audience questions and bring you back in. And thank you.
Thank you, Hallie, and thank you, Dr. Campman, and all our guests today. I think one of the most prevalent questions, and I believe we may have had this even in our first session, Dr. Campman, is I think something you can address, and that is there's so much concern for family members and patients who are being treated, I think specifically with methadone, but I'm sure it runs across the board, that they feel that now they've traded in one drug for another. And again, I know we've talked about this in the past, but I think it would be great to address that question because we're getting it a lot tonight.
Sure. Patients maintained on methadone, if they are taking the medication correctly and receiving good treatment, are virtually indistinguishable from other patients with any other medical illness. So this idea that if you're going to go to a methadone clinic and you're going to become a zombie or just trade one drug for another is just simply not true. It is a medicine. And if you take it, yes, you will be physically dependent on it, but you will not be engaging in the behaviors that define addiction as a disease according to the DSM, and you're going to have a productive life where you're going to go to work, you're going to take care of your family, you're going to enjoy life, even when you're on methadone. Now, methadone is not my favorite medicine because I think it's hard for patients to come to a methadone clinic and take it on a daily basis. I think that's difficult. I think that's one of the beauties of buprenorphine is it has many of the benefits that we can get from methadone without having to go to a methadone clinic. Now, having said that, methadone is a really effective treatment, and I wouldn't dissuade anyone who wants to go and get treatment at a methadone clinic from going because it is very, very effective.
So as a follow-up question to that, if somebody is concerned about their use of methadone or their family members' use of methadone, can you direct them, or how would we direct them on who to see to transition to a different option, or if they don't want to continue being on that?
Right. Yeah, there's always options in treatment, and I think that if a patient went to their methadone provider and said, "I would like to switch off," I think that they would be able to do that and would help patients transition. And we're learning better and better ways now to transition patients from methadone to buprenorphine using specific dosing methods that really have made it a whole lot easier to transition than it used to be. And so that's very, very possible.
Great. Thank you. Some of the other questions we've been getting revolve a lot around one interesting question we got from somebody in crisis intervention that I think is a really important one is what is this group of people's advice if you're in crisis intervention to help families connect? Would it be to look for those follow-up links of resources in our follow-up email? Is there something specific you would direct them to do? Do you direct them to send families? They're not going to send a family to the ER, but what would you say to that?
Patients or family members, or patients who end up in crisis centers and family members who have patients who are in crisis centers need to access the certified recovery specialists at the Center for Opioid Recovery and Engagement, CORE. And we'll send out it's not quite a 24-hour line, but they're open from 6 in the morning until midnight, so it's pretty darn close. And they will be happy to talk to you about how to get engaged in treatment. They are in recovery themselves. They have experience with it. They're really good, and they're very, very helpful.
Terrific.
And that's one of the contact numbers that'll be distributed via email.
In our follow-up email. Yeah,
right.
Great. For those of you that talked about research in generational addiction or the genetics of addiction, there's been a lot of questions around, especially if you're in a situation where you have chronic pain or you're working with pain management, I guess a lot of people are concerned, how do I know if I have this genetic disposition, or if I do know I have a genetic disposition, how can I treat my pain if my doctor's telling me I need these opioids but not end up addicted? Where do you draw that line if you can? And what is your definition timeline-wise of you are addicted or you're not? So I think it's making people a little paranoid, right, to even go down that road.
And practitioners are also concerned about prescribing opioids for pain. And there's a lot of effort now to use non-opioid medications to treat pain, and non-opioid interventions like the one that Greg mentioned in terms of reframing the pain experience from sort of a crisis to a response. So I think that the way to go is ideally to not use opioids. Now, if opioids are called for, then short-term treatment is warranted. And unfortunately, we can't yet use things like polygenic risk scores to predict risk. And by the way, there are companies that are marketing batteries of genetic testing and other things. They really don't work. It's a mistake to it. They're misrepresenting what they can deliver. At this point, the state of the art is if you have a family history, if you've had prior problems with substances, if you have a a lot of depressive symptoms or anxiety symptoms that are relieved by an opiate, for example, you are at increased risk of developing an opioid use disorder with chronic exposure. So limiting exposure to a period of days or weeks is the way to go to prevent developing dependence.
Great, thank you. We also had some questions about, I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer this, but maybe Dr. Corder, whether or not there is hope to have gene therapies for people with genetic marker. Obviously we're a ways off from even knowing what that genetic marker specifically is, but once we do wrap our heads in the science around that, you expect to see gene therapy being a tool to be used in the future?
Yeah, so I'm assuming some people listening have heard of a technique called like CRISPR, which allows for gene editing. I want to say I do not think that is on the time horizon whatsoever for treating a disease that's as complex as addiction. As Dr. Kimber mentioned too, we don't even yet fully understand the interactions of genes and how those might lead to different types of substance use disorders. So I do not believe that we're going to be editing DNA for the purposes of treating these types of disease states overall. Now, gene therapies are a very broad class, or it's a conceptual class of possible medications overall, and there are active efforts aimed at using something called chemogenetics that allow for turning cells, or specifically these neurons, on or off at will using synthetic proteins. And it's something that our lab is involved with, as well as the gene therapy program here at Penn, and a number of labs around the world. Now, this is still going to be very far off into the future, but this basically allows us to insert different types of DNA sequences that are from outside the body into specific neurons, and that would allow us to control those cells and that neuron functions in a very tight, precise manner where it's needed in the brain when patients would need it. But that's not going to necessarily involve genetics per se, as far as like understanding results coming from GWAS studies overall.
Okay. One more question for Dr. Corder. When a person uses opioid pain medicine beyond medical necessity, then a person has a greater reward or dopamine increase? I think that was a question. Is that what you were saying? And therefore, are those people more vulnerable to pleasure-seeking use? So I guess if they're using it and they don't have a medical need, does that make them more susceptible to ending up with an opioid use disorder?
That can be complicated. As has been discussed, there are patients that can be more predisposed to have a greater pleasure response, if you will, or different types of motivational drug-seeking responses based off of the genetic variants, which ultimately lead to changes in how these neurons are structured and how they signal and work together within the brain. Generally, opioids prescribed are going to reduce the signals between neurons related to pain, and if you were to continue to take those opioid compounds, they classically, at least as we understand them, result in increased dopamine in an area called the nucleus accumbens of the striatum in our brains, and that kind of reinforces the use of these drugs. That does not necessarily mean if you take an opioid, you're going to transition to addiction. I think I don't know the exact numbers, but I think of chronic pain patients taking opioid drugs, it's something around 8 to 10% of those patients might misuse those drugs, and then somewhere between 2 to 4% of patients might transition to using recreational opioid drugs beyond their intended medical use. So it's still absolutely affecting tens of thousands of people, but I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong.
No, thank you. That's been another question we've gotten, and it's good to hear that while the percentage represents a lot, thousands of people, it's good to know that for those that do deal with chronic pain, that it's not the majority of the people ending up addicted and with an issue.
Yeah, because there's people
I
who
do.
feel. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay. I didn't mean to cut you off. I just wanted, I think it's such an important question when people ask, where can this be prescribed? Where can that be prescribed? So one of the questions is, where can you get a prescription for Suboxone? And I think it's important to reiterate to everybody listening, we are putting these resource links in the chat. We will put them in the follow-up email. So if you are listening, we have your email because you must have registered. You will get that follow-up email with those links. We will talk to Dr. Campman and make sure we put the right contact in there. If another physician wants to get involved in the research, that's those things we've talked about. Hallie, I'd love to throw it back to you. I know that you're so good at listening and keep coming up with more questions. I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you think anything needs more clarification as we get to this 5:30 mark, I want to make sure we're addressing what we should.
One of the things that I'm seeing in the chat, thanks to Teresa and Sarah and Scott also for asking this question, was we had touched on about genetics and the swabs to make predictions about different medications that could be useful. I think the question that came up is, are you saying that the current genetic swab results aren't valuable since some clinicians value them? What's your input? So can we just maybe clarify that for people that were here and still curious?
I think that the answer to that depends on exactly which swabs and genetic tests people are talking about. As we were saying, for these polygenic risk scores, currently I would not recommend that an individual gets them. I don't think that they are really going to tell you anything beyond what you already know based on your family history. There are some genetic variants that can show an individual that might be more sensitive or less sensitive to particular medications. I don't know if there are any in this area, and maybe one of the other panel members could comment more on the pharmacogenetics side for substance use disorders. But for the polygenic risk score kind of measures, currently I don't think that you're going to get anything meaningful from them.
There are pharmacogenetic panels for drugs like antidepressants that seem to have that have some clinical utility, particularly for people who haven't responded to a number of trials of antidepressants, because they may have metabolic features. They may break down the antidepressant more quickly, or they may, for other metabolic reasons, not be responding to the medication. And those panels can help to identify drugs that may be more useful. They're not incredibly useful. They have some marginal clinical value, but we're still early in this whole process, unfortunately. And so family history may help there as well. People whose family members have responded to a particular treatment effectively may also respond well to that treatment. But that's a pretty blunt instrument in terms of figuring out what to use.
Okay, and the other thing that I'm seeing, there's actually a question about using psychedelics to treat addiction. Is that something?
That's a very hot area.
Yeah.
And it is not, it is also very early in its use, though there's a very long literature. There's literature that goes back 50 years on that, using LSD. There are companies now using psilocybin to treat addictive disorders, dimethyltryptamine, another hallucinogenic. Nothing is approved for that indication. All of the trials to date are small and I think not conclusive, but it's an area of considerable interest in drug development.
Great. And another thing that's coming up go ahead, Cheryl, did you have something?
No, go ahead.
Another thing that's coming up First of all, there's a ton of thank yous in this chat for everyone, for all the doctors here and all the work that you're doing. People who are taking, medications every day, families that are struggling and want to understand why people aren't also talking to their family members who also deal with addiction, by proxy in a sense, or, as a result of living with other people. There's a lot of questions about stigma and how that holds people back from getting treatment, or, just from stepping forward and speaking their truth, whether it's to their younger generations that it could even support in the sense of prevention. But I guess overall, the biggest thing that we could ask next is, to kind of wrap up, is what would the message that each of you would have for our community, knowing that besides the fact that there will be another program, which will be great to know that Penn's going to be hosting another program, what's something that's important to you, knowing that questions are coming from so many different people, family members struggling, researchers, clinicians, everybody trying to understand this disease? What's something that you'd like to leave our audience with?
Who would you like to go first?
You, you, Dr. Kranzler.
So I think the quote that I mentioned earlier, that substance use disorders are a brain disease and it matters. And that combined, we have very good genetic evidence, and it's just increasing in its volume and its strength of evidence. And treatment is available, and there are treatments that work. Not all substance use disorders respond to medication, but certainly alcohol use disorder, tobacco use disorder, opioid use disorder, all respond to FDA-approved medications and other medications that are used off-label. So treatment is certainly worth pursuing.
Dr. Kemper? Yeah, Dr. Kemper.
I'd like to actually take a second just to thank the audience for joining us in this. I think it's very important that individuals are understanding some of the science behind it, and to back up what Dr. Kranzler said, understanding that this is a brain disease and that there is treatment available. And hopefully with the work that we are doing in the future, we will be able to understand more about the biology and hopefully therefore develop better treatments for this disorder.
Dr. Corder?
I think I want to just echo what Dr. Kemper just said, that to thank the audience, the fact that you're here and you're showing an interest in your lives and in research is so critical and so important. So just knowing and understanding that, there are scientists and researchers actively working on these diseases, and that I think we're making progress. I think there are really exciting avenues, from psychedelics to gene therapies to psychiatric interventions. And I think this interaction with scientists and the public is only going to continue to make our jobs better and hopefully translate to making everyone else's lives better too. And so I think that's just important to know overall. No one's alone. We're all in this together, sort of thing.
And finally, Dr. Campman?
We have treatments that work. We have treatments that save lives, literally save lives. And patients need to take advantage of them. And I know sometimes they come in and it doesn't work for one reason or another. They just have to keep coming back. And families need to understand that too, that to keep your family member focused and just keep trying, because these things really do work and they really do save lives.
Yeah, and it's great that you said that. There was, in the film that I've been working on, there was a family, the oldest daughter had been to 17 treatment centers and had been struggling with addiction before she achieved long-term sobriety. And to see, her family stick with her in terms of support and love, to now she's realizing, 4 years of sobriety, and, they say it's a long road and it continues to be a long road. but just knowing that, seeing her as one example of somebody who could go from the place where she was to being able to serve others in her role as a senior treatment advisor is reassuring. So many families are struggling in our city and around the world. Hopefully you've seen that, these incredible doctors are pursuing other avenues to support your families, to support research that's so important, and, to hopefully shed light on some of the missing pieces and some of the pieces that we could all be doing even better. So I'm thankful for the Penn community. Thank you so much for all your hard work to our panelists tonight, and also to the audience. There are so many amazing questions here. I'm hoping that we'll be able to ask the doctors these questions and send them in the email. That's my crazy brainstorm that everybody will be mad at me for later, but it seems really you're asking really important questions, and hopefully everybody will have your questions answered. Thanks for being here and for being part of a community that cares.